Thank you for joining, friends. We know we have others trickling in. We're so glad you're here. And it's a delight to be with a great scholar and leader in Israel today. The topic of the class is 6 Knocks of Repentance. What are the critical lessons Israeli society needs to learn after October 7th? I'm sure we all have a lot of thoughts and feelings about that. We'll have the chance to hear from Rabbi Avidan and his sharing, and then the chance to open the conversation with questions as well. Just a little bit about him, although he's not new to Valley Gate Midrash. Rabbi Avidan Freedman completed a master's degree in Jewish education at the Azrieli Graduate School and received rabbinic ordination from Yeshivat Chovevei Torah and from the Israeli Rabbinate. He's an educator at the Shalom Hartman Institute's high school and post-high school program, and an activist who founded Yanshuf, an organization dedicated to establishing moral limits for Israeli weapons exports. I encourage you to learn more about that important work at www.yanshuf.org. I will also post this bio in the chat in case, since I'm in some sketchy Wi-Fi, in case it didn't come in totally well. But yes, 6 Knocks of Repentance. What are the critical lessons Israeli society needs to learn after October 7th? Rabbi Avidan, Rabbi Freedman, thank you for being here.
Shalom to everyone from Israel, from Efrat, during difficult days. Thank you, Rav Shmuley. It's so great to be here. I have spoken a number of times. I've had the privilege of sharing my work in Yanshuf and the thinking behind it for me as a Zionist, as religious Zionist. But today, really, I wanted to share something a little bit different with you. They're difficult days. They're historic days. And as Rav Shmuley said, I want to try to share my own modest thoughts. I think when you talk about the critical lessons that Israeli society needs to learn, everybody is going to have their own ideas, and these are my ideas that I wanted to share with you about them. As I said, really, it's times of historic proportions. You might say even biblical proportions. And something that's really remarkable about our people is that from the very moment, in my experience, that October 7th happened, from October 8th, people, as we're fighting for our lives, we're also asking ourselves the question, what does this mean? What does it all mean? And in some ways, it's a very unnatural question. You know, you're fighting for survival. What are you asking what it means? But we're meaning-seeking creatures, and certainly in Judaism, we're always looking for the deeper meaning of what's going on. It's also a very tricky question. In some ways, it's even a dangerous question, especially when it has religious overtones. And when it comes to the Jewish people, when it comes to Israel, it's always going to have religious overtones and undertones. That's something that's inescapable. So what I want to try to do with you in the next 45 minutes or so is to present my own modest thoughts on this topic for your consideration. But first, before we dive into it, I want to give two introductions. Introduction number one is a kind of a word from my sponsor. This is a lecture that's based on an essay that I wrote in Hebrew in the context of a wonderful program I had the privilege of being a part of this year, which was called Lema'aseh Beit Midrash LaHalacha Yisraelit, a Beit Midrash of Israeli halacha. And it's an attempt. It was a small group of 10 people from really the entire range of Israeli religious background and experience, trying to think about what does halacha mean in Israel today as a concept that can speak to all sectors of Israeli society. We put out this book called Zikaron Israeli, which talks about it in terms specifically of October 7th and how do we give a Jewish meaning to the memory of October 7th. And these are my thoughts in that context. The second introduction I want to make is I want to warn you, this lecture it's really kind of insider baseball. It's a very profoundly Israeli view of the critical lessons Israeli society needs to learn. I really believe that all of you, wherever you live, are very significant stakeholders in this story. But I am going to say that I think the application of what all of this means for Jews globally, I'm not going to get into in the context of the limited time that we have, and I'll leave it for everyone to continue to reflect on and to think about for yourselves. What does this mean for the Jewish people? What does this mean for the world everywhere? So that said, if anyone here is familiar with Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's masterful speech, Goad, the voice of my beloved knocketh, which was a speech given on Israeli Independence Day 1956 in Yeshiva University, my alma mater in New York, you might already sense that I'm going to be adopting Rabbi Soloveitchik's theological framework and trying to apply it to the events of our day. And in order to present that, I want to start with a very famous passage of the Rambam, of Maimonides, that relates to the period of the Jewish calendar that we are entering right now. We're entering the period now of the fasts of the destruction of the temple. There are 4 fasts over the course of the year. A few of them are blips. Asara B'Tevet, Tzom Gedalia, they exist as islands. But the period we're entering now from Shiva Asar B'Tammuz until Tisha B'Av is a period of greater and greater intensity of experiencing the memory of the destruction of the temple. And in the beginning of the book in which he discusses these laws, Maimonides sets out the basic theology that underlies the idea of fasting. And he says the following, chapter 1, right at the beginning, it is a positive Torah commandment to cry out and to sound trumpets in the event of any difficulty that arises, which affects the community. In other words, crying out, and which is ultimately translated into fasting, it is not just about historical events, it's also about any difficulty that arises. Should the people fail to cry out to God and sound the trumpets, and instead say, what has happened to us is merely a natural phenomenon, and this difficulty is merely a chance occurrence, this is a cruel conception of things. The Rambam calls this derech achazariyut, is a cruel way, which causes them to remain attached to their wicked deeds. This is implied by the Torah's statement, which we read recently in the Parsha. It was actually my son's Bar Mitzvah Parsha. If you remain indifferent to me, im telchui mikeri, I will be indifferent to you with a vengeance. V'halachti imachem b'chamat keri. The Rambam continues, the implication of the verse is, when I bring difficulties upon you, so that you shall repent, and you say it is a chance occurrence, I will add to your punishment an expression of vengeance for that indifference to divine providence. We cry out and we fast, the Rambam is saying, in order to express our belief that these bad things were not mere happenstance. They didn't happen by accident. They carry a moral message for us that we must repair our ways. I mentioned earlier that this is a dangerous kind of thinking, but Maimonides is emphasizing for a minute the danger of the other side, danger of thinking that our life has no meaning, that there is no message for us. But let's go back to the danger that I think many of us probably very instinctively feel towards this idea of saying that when calamity befalls us, there is a divine meaning to it, and God is telling us something. For our generation, the closest source of that challenge before October 7th, of course, was the Holocaust. How could someone possibly take this passage seriously after the Holocaust? How can you say that, well, the Holocaust happened because X, Y, and Z, and when the Holocaust happened, we were made to think about why is God doing that? How can any of those statements be taken seriously? How can they be meaningful? But on the other hand, there is a certain cruelty in leaving these kinds of events as a black hole of meaning. And I think that's an instinct that people here in Israel have felt very, very profoundly, that it would be a tragedy not to learn something from this, to leave this as something that is meaningless. And I hear people talking about it, again, literally from October 8th. What does this mean? Why is this happening? What are we supposed to learn from this? Now, the question is, how do we navigate this dilemma? And in the shadow of the Holocaust, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the Rav, as I call him, suggests a very compelling and innovative religious model. It's very, I think, familiar to many, but for just in case, we'll present it now and go through it. And Rabbi Soloveitchik basically suggests 2 paradigms. He writes the following in his speech, really, Fate and Destiny, Kol Dodi Dofek. He says, posing the question of suffering, claims Judaism, is possible in 2 separate dimensions, the dimension of fate and the dimension of destiny. So what does the dimension of fate mean? I'm going to fill in a little bit. Fate is the idea of the existence that's forced upon us. To encounter suffering as a person of fate, Rabbi Soloveitchik explains, is to experience suffering to first of all experience it, and not to be able to do anything about it beyond the maximum is to try to explain it, to try to conceptually, theologically, intellectually say, what does this mean? But the Rav says, surprisingly, this is a futile endeavor. And I am continuing to read. Judaism, with its realistic approach to man and his status within existence, understood that evil does not lend itself to being obscured and glossed over. Judaism determined that man, submerged in the depths of a frozen fate, will in vain seek the solution to the problem of evil in the context of speculative thought, for he will never find it. Right? Humanity's attempt to explain evil, the Rav is saying, to understand it is doomed to failure. You can't do it. There are things we're just not going to understand, and it's actually even worse. He says when you turn evil into, when you explain it, you're almost turning it into something good. You're saying, well, this happened because of X, Y, and Z, so it's actually good. And the Rav says that's the wrong thing. That's not what we're supposed to do. And here he's kind of upending this classic religious explanation of Gamzu Latova, of this is for the good. So what is his alternative? What does he suggest? He suggests the approach of destiny. And here he says something very, very interesting. And I'll read again. When the man of destiny suffers, he says in his heart, there is evil. I do not deny it. And I will not conceal it with fruitless casuistry. I am, however, interested in it from a halachic point of view. And as a person who wants to know what action to take, I ask a single question. What should the sufferer do to live with his suffering? In this dimension, the emphasis is removed from causal and teleological considerations, which differ only as to direction, meaning why did this happen, what caused it, or teleological, what is the purpose of this, and is directed to the realm of action. We don't ask the question of why did this happen, or what does God want us to understand from this? We ask a question of action. What do we do with this? The problem is now formulated in the language of a simple halacha and revolves around a quotidian daily task. The question of questions is, Rabbi Soloveitchik suggests, what does suffering obligate man to do? There's a famous passage in the Talmud that says, if suffering comes to you, you should examine your deeds. And usually the way that's understood is the way we understood the Rambam, the standard religious understanding of suffering. If you're suffering, you must have done something bad, so think about the bad things that you did. Rav Soloveitchik doesn't accept this understanding. He upends it. He says, no, we're not interested in a causal connection. That would be what he calls fruitless casuistry. The Rav says, when you suffer, you don't ask yourself why. You ask yourself, what now? What can I do with this? How do I use this suffering to better myself? But the question is, how do you go about doing this? If we can't understand the why it happened, how are you supposed to get at the what? And here Rabbi Soloveitchik has a couple of interesting suggestions. It's not just about taking the suffering and using it positively in any way. There is something more specific in the dynamic that Rabbi Soloveitchik suggests in this piece of Kol Dodi Dofek. And he says like this: what obligation accrues to the sufferer as a result of his suffering? What commanding heavenly voice breaks through from the midst of suffering? The Rav is suggesting that a careful consideration of our circumstances gives us a sense of a commanding voice. How do we do this? So the Rav suggests an interesting dynamic that, for me, really resonates with what we're going through. And he says, sometimes, again, I'm quoting, it happens that man is summoned to repair through his afflictions the damage he caused in God's creation at the hour when the Holy One extended his bounty. And what the Rav here is saying is that times of calm, times of good, times of bounty also have a commanding voice. It's not just from suffering that there is a certain command of what we're meant to do. When we enjoy bounty, there's also a commanding voice. But very often, too often, we don't take heed in bounty, and then we are condemned to try to hear that same commanding voice out of our suffering. I'll give you a kind of a silly example of this that happened to me, my teeth. Somehow it happened that with Corona and whatever in life, I didn't have a dental checkup for 6 years. Avidan, bad idea. I ignored the commanding voice of, regular dental checkups for 6 years. Now, there were all kinds of signs along the way, but overall, I felt good. My teeth were fine. Everything was working. So I ignored that commanding voice. Of course, the way life works is if you ignore it for long enough, then it's going to hit you and hit you hard. And so after 6 years, I needed to go and have major dental surgery in order to fix what I hadn't listened to, because I was suffering, because I felt it in my mouth. And that's kind of the dynamic that happens in life very, very often. And thinking about the current moment, this idea resonated very, very powerfully. And I want to share with you how. On the eve of Simchat Torah, I felt, and I think in Israeli society, many people, maybe we all felt, that we were on the precipice of an internal religious war, a civil war. My biggest fear going into Simchat Torah, I remember it vividly, was that there was going to be a repeat of the kinds of things that happened on Yom Kippur, where on Yom Kippur there were these public prayers outside that were in violation of certain legal and municipal standards. And there were fights and there was screaming on Yom Kippur, on the holiest day. And everything, all the indications said that Simchat Torah was going to be a repeat, and even worse. And we really felt ourselves as the Jewish people just torn apart. And then Simchat Torah happens, 6:30 in the morning, before any of those fights can happen, and we're attacked by an external enemy. And all of a sudden, really immediately, this slogan that we see everywhere, I have it here if you see on this building in Tel Aviv, Yachad Nenatzeach. And it just became immediately the slogan of everyone in Israel. Asur laharos, don't destroy, Yachad Nenatzeach. Together we will prevail. And for a time that really, really held. Even when I wrote this article months and months ago, it was already clear that it wasn't going to hold for very long. This idea of the chasm, the civil war that was imminent, that was erased and replaced with this beautiful unity in the people of Israel, it wasn't going to hold. And Rav Soloveitchik speaks to this idea, and he says the following. He says, when the doctrine of the corrective effect of suffering is put into practice, it demands of the sufferer courage and spiritual discipline. He must gird himself with extraordinary strength, make a detached assessment of his world, examine his past, and look to his future with complete honesty. Rav Soloveitchik says it's not so simple as like a nice cliche, biachad and natseach, together we will prevail and everything will be hunky-dory. In order for that kind of a thing to hold, you need to really do some serious cheshbon nefesh. You need to do some serious introspection in order for it to hold. And that's the journey that I want to suggest, I want to take you on. Now, before we go on to our journey, Rav Soloveitchik, he takes this idea and he suggests that the creation of the state of Israel represented 6 divine knocks. These were 6 expressions of that commanding voice that spoke through the chesed, through the bounty, through the loving kindness. What Rav Soloveitchik was saying in 1956 was, we have this amazing opportunity now of the state of Israel, these 6 knocks, and we dare not ignore them. I want to take this same model. I want to suggest 6 knocks of a different type. I want to suggest 6 knocks on the heart. These are the knocks of the vidui. These are the knocks of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, of our confession. And I want to say that we have 6 areas that we need to take an accounting for. We need, as Israeli society, to do some cheshbon nefesh in order to be able to really give a meaning and a lasting sense to this idea of together we will prevail, of what biyachad and natseach means, because again, way back then it was coming apart, and there's, I have to say, little left of it now in many ways, sadly. So here are the 6 knocks of confession that I want to suggest, and we'll take them piece by piece. Now, I want to put out again, there's nothing scientific about these. It's very subjective. These are my own thoughts and reflections, and you're invited to think about them and what they mean to you. And hopefully we'll also have some time for questions, but definitely not enough time for questions. And I invite you also to reach out afterwards if you're interested to continue the conversation. And when I thought about these knocks, I'm really thinking historically about the period from when Israel left Gaza, the disengagement in 2005, where Israel leaves Gaza and creates this vacuum that Hamas then enters, and that timeline, that trajectory until our day. But it's definitely true that a lot of the issues that I'm talking about, I think, have even deeper roots in Israeli society. So here are the 6. We've trampled, we've tolerated, we've neglected, we've marginalized, we've demonized, we've been blind. What do these 6 knocks mean? I want to take them one by one. We've trampled. If my starting point is this social schism right before October 7th that I was talking about, that almost civil war, the words that came up again and again in Israeli society around that, leading up to that, during the judicial reform, was the word in Hebrew lidros, to trample. The judicial reform was experienced by people who opposed it as something that trampled everything they held dear. But again and again, in subtext and sometimes explicitly, the people who were pushing it forward expressed their sense of having been trampled during the disengagement of 2005. Now, I don't want to get into, and I'm not interested in whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing. And there are people who say, because, October 7th was because of the disengagement, and there are people who say that the very, very opposite. I'm setting all of that aside. That's not what interests me right now. Personally, I'll just say I was actually in favor of the disengagement at the time. But the point isn't the policy; it's how it was affected, and it's the feeling of the people upon whom it was done, and that was the feeling of trampling. People felt trampled before, during, and especially after. Now in Israel we have mefunim, we have tens of thousands of people who have been taken out of their home, who've been evacuated. Back then we also had evacuees. We had 8,000 people who were taken out of their homes. I don't think they were given the public recognition that they deserved for the courageous decision that they made to sacrifice their cause for the sake of the people. If you think about biyachad ninatzeach, together we will be triumphant, we will prevail. During the disengagement, the people who decided to sacrifice their sense of nitzachon, their sense of victory, for the biyachad, in order to maintain the togetherness. The people who, there were so many fears that there would be civil war, that people would use their weapons in order to fight the IDF, and that didn't happen. People were peacefully taken out of their homes. And that wasn't celebrated. I wonder what would have happened if everyone who disagreed with them, who were against what they did, against that they were living there, would have showered them with as much love and appreciation as the Jewish people today shower the evacuees. What would that have done for our biyachad, our togetherness? So I think the first confession that we need to make is we have trampled. We have trampled one another now. We have trampled one another then. And we need to really think about where we were as far as that happening. And we have tolerated. What's bad about tolerance? Well, if the previous confession is about our lack of tolerance for other people, trampling them, what did we tolerate? After the disengagement, we tolerated and normalized a way of life that we had no right to normalize. Because while I was living comfortably in my house, the residents of the South, what became known as the Gaza envelope, they were running constantly to these bomb shelters. And that was their life, but we tolerated that. In Hebrew, it's hachala. We were able to live with that. Well, it's very easy for many, many people who didn't have to live with it. It's very courageous of those people who did, but where is the solidarity? How could it be that people lived through that experience for years and years and years, and we didn't feel like that was us going through that and that we needed to do something about it. There is something missing in our sense of solidarity by the ability to tolerate that amount of suffering of people. We have tolerated. And the third knock, we have neglected. When Israel did respond from time to time with operations to attacks from Gaza, when we weren't tolerating it, there was also a price that we paid. There were soldiers and there were citizens that were taken captive by Hamas, and we didn't step up for our brothers and sisters being attacked, and we didn't stand up for the people who were taken captive. I have a sticker, I don't know if you can see it. We're counting the days of captivity. I'm at day 271. But Avera Mengistu, he has been held captive by Hamas for 3,587 days, almost a decade. He is there in Hamas captivity, very likely still alive. Hadar Goldin and Oron Shaul, soldiers who were taken captive during an operation, during military operations, for a long time it wasn't clear to the public, at least, whether they were dead or alive. And even afterwards, their families were advocating them and advocating. I see every day on a bus near where I live this slogan, Kulanu im hanehedarim. We're all with. Here it's a play on words. In Hebrew, nehedar is captive or hostage, and nehedar is wonderful, and hadar. But I'll tell you honestly, I wasn't there. We had hostages, and I feel like I wasn't there enough, and we weren't there enough for them. And again, who knows? If we had done, imagine, all we're doing for all of our hostages, all of the 120 hostages now, if we're doing everything for one hostage, back then, where would we be now? Maybe we would be in a very different place if we hadn't neglected. If our sense of solidarity had been just that much stronger, just that much more of a sense of we're all in this together. And if even one, the Torah says in Sefer Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers that we're now reading in a story a little bit later on, that in an early battle, one captive, Vayish Mimenu Shevi, one captive is taken from the Jewish people, and the Jewish people stand up and they declare war. We've neglected. When it wasn't happening to us, when it was our ideological opponent, when it was someone far away, when the trampling didn't bother us, when the rockets weren't falling on us, when it wasn't our family members, I think what we're being called on, what I want to suggest about the commanding voice right now is take a hard look at our sense of solidarity. And now I want to move one more step in. Part of looking at solidarity is thinking about which parts of us we didn't have enough empathy for. Who was included in the us and who wasn't a part of the us? Who did we marginalize? And many events of these past months have forced us to really broaden our sense of the us and challenge us to try to broaden it even further. The Bedouin and Muslim soldiers who gave their lives for Jews on October 7th, they're also part of the us. The African asylum seekers who volunteered to do their part in the wake of October 7th were often marginalized. They're also part of the us. The women soldiers who did so much, who often were marginalized, who were said they can't fill those kinds of functions in the Israeli army. So many things have happened to us. The LGBT couples who are being recognized by the army because one of the members fell in battle, and so that forces Israel to recognize their relationship, which hadn't been done. Who is the us? Again, Rav Soloveitchik said, what did he say? Man is summoned to repair through his afflictions the damage he caused in God's creation at the hour when the Holy One extended his bounty. We, over the course of the years, lacked in solidarity of who is the us and how do we define that? And these events, in so many ways, have opened our eyes to who that us, who needs to be included. And I want to take it one step further. We've demonized this othering, defining someone else not as me, as the other, spread like a cancer in our society, deeper and deeper and in closer and closer circles. I think what started as the attitude towards outsiders ultimately became the transformation of people very, very similar to me also into others. As I mentioned before, in Simchat Torah, we were afraid of a civil war because what? Because during the year of judicial reform, people who dedicated decades of their lives to protecting Israel took a drastic step, announced that they would stop volunteering for reserve duty, and they were branded as traitors. They were seen as anti-Zionists. There was even a campaign. I have a screen capture of it over here in Israel that dramatized a pilot who refuses to provide cover for another soldier until they know their opinion on judicial reform. Our absence of solidarity mutated until we became our own worst enemy. If it started from others who weren't enough a part of us, it soon enough became ourselves. And we really became, you see here one of a famous poster that says, Smolanim Bogdim. Left-wingers are traitors. And that left-winger was fully half of the country. And that's how we were looking at each other. We had demonized each other. The other was no longer the other. The other was a demon, was a threat, was an enemy. And that's where we were. The sixth knock, we were blind. We were blind. I think the thread that runs through all of these sins, through all of these are all really different reflections of one phenomenon. Trampling and tolerating, neglecting, marginalizing, demonizing. You can call it a lack of solidarity, a lack of empathy. I want to say it's a kind of blindness. It's a blindness to the other. It's a blindness to their suffering. It's a blindness to their needs. And I want to say for a moment, I've been focusing on relationships within Israeli society, but this blindness relates to the suffering of the other who is on the other side of the border as well. And that also meaning the Palestinian other who is suffering from what's going on, as justified, as necessary as everything we're doing might be. That doesn't mean that human beings aren't suffering, and it doesn't mean that Israeli society, really, I'm pounding on my own chest here, needs to do a better job of recognizing that and not being blind to it. And that's a blindness that I think also started in 2005, because in 2005 the disengagement wasn't about the Palestinians and the Gazans, and we were willing to be blind to their suffering as we propped up a murderous, corrupt Hamas government who was murderous and corrupt not only towards us but very much towards its own people. And that's a blindness that we need to think about. We need to reflect on. Now, I want to think, and I want to make a suggestion about what caused this blindness, because I really think that that's the core of everything I've said. And I want to make a counterintuitive suggestion. I've been pointing out that in different ways along the way, what's cured our blindness, what's allowed us to open our eyes in new ways, has been the war, has been the suffering, has been crisis and tragedy and weakness. And so what I want to suggest is, could it be that what caused much of this blindness was actually our success and our experience of God's bounty, and especially our experience of power? Could it be that it's not weakness but power that caused us blindness? This is a dynamic that Moshe talks about on the eve of Israel's crossing the Jordan. He says like this, he says, in the third generation, your success will cause you to forget God and to say, it is my power that has brought me this success. When you have begotten children and children's children and are long established in the land, right? That's where we are. We are in the kind of the fourth generation. We're in the, after the founders, after the builders. We're in year 76 of Israel. That's where we are. When you have eaten your fill and you have built fine houses to live in, and your herds and flocks have multiplied, and your silver and gold have increased, and everything you own has prospered. You are powerful. The sense of power is intoxicating. It's addictive. And like every addiction, it blinds you. The Torah says, beware lest your heart grow haughty and you forget your God and you say to yourselves, my own power and the might of my own hand, kochi v'otzem yadi, have won this wealth for me. Asali et hachayil hazeh. When you have power, you feel like you don't need to see the other. That's what the government felt when pushing forward the judicial reform. No, we have the power. We have 64 seats. We have control. We have the voice of the people. All of that is true. But does that mean that you can be blind to the other 56 seats, to the other almost half of the population that feels differently because of your power? This is what we felt towards Hamas before October 7th. We have power. We don't need to worry. We don't need to worry about the warnings. We don't need to worry about everything that's being said because we are so powerful and we are so haughty and we are so full of ourselves. I want to say that this is the most significant danger of our return to Zion, the corrupting influence of power. This was the warning of the prophet Zechariah. And this is the idea that actually is the inspiration for the symbol of the Jewish state, as opposed to kochi v'otzem yadi asali et hachayil hazeh, my own power is what has given me this success, this chayil. Zechariah says in the famous prophecy, lo bechayil v'lo bechoach ki im beruchi, not through might, not through power, but it is through my spirit. That's the vision of the menorah. That's, if we had more time, we would go through the verses, but that's the menorah. This menorah that you see sits right across from the Knesset in order to remind ourselves of this message. It's not through might. It is through our spirit first and foremost. And I think that's a level of introspection, of cheshbon nefesh, we need to really, really do. I want to say that as difficult as these days are, I think that we are in a moment pregnant with new possibilities. The war has received a lot of names. I actually just saw a news report that said that because it hasn't received its official name, there is an issue with how they're creating the headstones of the soldiers that have fallen. But my son's school gave it a name, and I think it's ingenious, and it really speaks to me. And they called this Milchemet Mashiv Haruach, the war of returning the spirit, because it started on Simchat Torah, and that's the day in Israel where we begin saying those words everywhere in our prayers. We begin saying the words Mashiv Haruach, he who returns the spirit. And it's also a prayer that God should return the spirit of our captives and should return to us and fill us with the spirits of all of those who are sacrificing. I can't tell you how much I hoped that by the time Pesach came around, when we stop in our prayers saying the words Mashiv Haruach, when the summer comes, I so deeply, deeply hoped that we would have succeeded. We would have ended the war. We should have ended the war. And I'll be honest, actually, I've actually continued saying those words in my prayers against common practice. I say Mashiv Haruach umorid hatal. Halachically okay, it's uncommon, but I can't stop praying and expressing that prayer for God to return the Ruach to us. We're 9 months in, 270, 40, right? 40 weeks, 10 months, 9 full months. It's a time for a new rebirth. And I think there's a possibility for something new to be born here. For the first 3 generations, for the first 75 years of our existence, we were really focused on the koach. We were focused on the physical power. We had a lot of existential anxiety and post-trauma. And we always told ourselves we need to do what we need to do in order to survive. And that's what we've been kind of saying to ourselves for 75 years. It's the koach, it's the power that we need. But we are at a stage in our history that we have no choice. We're being forced in this calamity to return to the Ruach. I think that's the commanding voice. We have no choice. We could have done it maybe long ago. Rav Shmuley asked if I'm going to mention Yanshuf's mission, and I'll just give a line about it because I can't not, because it's so core to my beliefs and to this as well. Yanshuf's mission is that Israel has to stop selling weapons to brutal human rights violators. We have to stop being the supporters and the partners of those who are committing atrocities all over the world. How did we justify that to ourselves? Because of the koach. Because we said, we need to do whatever we need to do for power. But it wasn't true. We need for a long time now already to have been led by the Ruach. We're really in a place, thank God, that we were comfortable enough, we were successful enough that we could have, in the bounty, made that decision, but we didn't. And when you don't do it in the time of bounty, there is no choice but to do it from a time of suffering. Our need for power became this addiction. Our addiction to power became a whole complex, became a whole survivor complex, and it became a complex of social ills and of blindness to so much in our society. It was very, very hard for us to question that power until this force came. And when this force came, where you think it's Hamas, who in terms of their power is not supposed to be able to challenge us, and yet they did. I say that's the time for us to reconsider what is really our foundation here. What needs to be the foundation to our lives? It's not that we didn't have enough power. It's not, and some people say this in the wake of October 7th, the lesson is we just need more power. We need less morality. No. Chas v'shalom. God forbid. Our powerlessness on October 7th was, if you think about it, just as illogical as our power and our victory in 1967. It doesn't make any logical sense that it could happen. So my hope and prayer is really that the introspection of this moment allows us to return to the spirit, Mashiv HaRuach, to rebuild our society based on our deepest values and our deepest moral commitments, because that's really who we are, and that's really who we need to be for the world. I really believe that is the commanding voice that could bring us out and truly redeem us from this difficult moment in Jewish history. So those are the thoughts that I wanted to share with you, and I'll stop the share now and open it up to a few minutes of questions.
Thank you so much. Yes, if anyone would like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hands and unmute, and we can call on people, and you can always write things in the chat as well. Hi, Judy.
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much, Rabbi. I also think that we have ignored the voices of the people on the other side. And I know that that's controversial. I have family in Israel who view Arabs as vermin, and I don't subscribe to that. Everybody's got a spark of God. So we've got to figure out how to engage in a way that has not been done for political reasons by leadership on both sides. I think that there are people who get a lot of gain from keeping the conflict going. So I think we can also do a bit of chest beating on that one as well.
Judy, I agree with you 1,000,000%. I don't know if, when you're talking about vermin, there was actually a case, a story that I wrote about. You could look it up in the Times of Israel, here in Efrat, where somebody used exactly that word, and I took him to task for it. And I'll tell you, here in Efrat, after October 7th, there was a whole movement not to let any Palestinian laborers in. And I understand the fear. It's not people who want to be evil. It's regular people like me and you who are really afraid. But I absolutely agree with you that when that slides over, and it slides over so quickly and too easily into outright racism and into the acceptance of that, then yes, we need to do some real introspection, and we need to think about what does it mean? What does it mean to live in this land where, you know, I say the land that God has given us, if I look at the state of Israel as a miracle, and I look at it as, you know, in some sense, really, as Rav Soloveitchik did, inspired by him, God's hand in history, then I also say that the fact that there are 8 million Jews and 8 million Arabs between the river and the sea is also God's hand in history. And we need to figure out how to live together and how to move forward together. And these are people who, in many ways, can be and should be, I mean, they are our family. You know, biblically speaking, they are our family. Theologically speaking and religiously speaking, they're our children. So I definitely agree with you. And again, there is this danger and a trend within Israeli society to go in that other direction, really in the direction, I say it, of power and more power. And we are, you know, it's a trauma, and so there's post-trauma. We need to build the walls even higher. And the voice that I'm trying to raise here in this class and here in Israel is that there's another path. There's another path, and it's a path it's a Jewish path. It's a path that's rooted in our sources and in our vision for what the Jewish state is supposed to be. That, like you said, Judy, embraces that core idea of every human being created in the image of God. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Thank you. There's a question from Michael in the chat that says, how do we develop a shared set of values across our society?
That's a great question. I think we have one, actually. I think there are a number of values which are very broadly shared within Israeli society today. I'll speak specifically about Israeli society. Actually spoke to it with someone at length today. I'm a big fan. I plugged my own writing twice already, so I'll plug somebody else's writing. I'm a big fan of Micha Goodman and his writing. He recently came out with a book. It's being translated in English already. Probably would be out soon, called The Eighth Day. And there he argues that about 70% of Israeli society believes in a Jewish and democratic state as fundamentals, not as technical things. Jewish as not just something demographic, but something about what our values are, and hand in hand, not at loggerheads, but actually hand in hand, to believe in democratic values, not just as something technical, meaning we vote, but believing in liberal democratic values. For myself, I see, could argue about it. We don't have the time now, but I see that the core, as Judy had said, the core of liberal democratic values very much within my idea of Judaism, with the core of that being the human being in the image of God, and so much really growing from that point. So I think that there are those shared values. We actually have a very, very rich bed of shared values that we can draw from. And even in Israel today, with all of the division and all of the schisms that exist, there is the potential to draw on that. We've got some work we need to do. That what Micha Goodman suggests is that there is this identity politics that has kind of leached on to that and is ripping apart the consensus, where you have this broad consensus, but part of the camp identifies itself as a right, and part of the camp is identified maybe more by others as left, and they see themselves as warring. But we have that. It's there. And I want to say one other thing. We also have the value of machloket, the value of debate that is l'shem shamayim, that is not personal, is not ad hominem, but a debate which values differences of opinions, makes room for them. The house of Hillel, who said the opinion of the house of Shammai before its own opinion, that's who we decide like. The house of Hillel, who was modest and humble, that's who we decide like. So we have these values to create a shared society, and also to create a way to handle our disagreements in a positive way. We have a lot of work to do it in practice, but I think we have an unbelievable nation and people and potential to do it. So the potential is very much there.
Thank you. Another question in the chat from Aglaya that says, "Thank you for this talk. What are your ideas about working with children and young adults to make better choices?"
I'm an educator. That's my profession. So working with children and young adults is definitely the question, and I think it's really the solution. I mean, myself over the past year, a couple of years, I've actually been pulled more and more into political activism because I felt that there was such a dire need to and urgent and critical need to be involved in very immediate political issues, judicial reform, and now elections. But the real answer is education. The real answer is teaching our kids how to honor others, how to see others, right? How to respect the other as an other, as a Tselem Elohim, as an image of God, and to listen. I mean, there's so much work to do. I see it. This is a different Micha Goodman book about what technology has done, and this is a lot of the division in society, and there are many books that have been written about it actually. How the divisiveness and the polarization of society has a lot to do with the fact that we have these algorithms that put us in bubbles where we just hear our own echo chamber and never talk to somebody else and see them. And there's so much value to just having real life conversations with children, with young adults. Put the devices aside, the screens aside, and talk to people. There's so much work we need to be doing. That's the real work, and that's where the salvation, that's the deep work that salvation will come from, I believe.
Thank you. I think we can take one more question. It looks like there was a follow-up from Michael about shared values that said, "The shared values are not obvious in our political system. Who should lead our development of this shared sense of values?"
Shmuley, Rav Shmuley should. That's what I think. I think there are. That's who I'd say yes, and who I'd say no is not the folks who are political leaders in Israel today. That's for sure. I think that our political leadership, if it had a shred of moral integrity, would long ago have said, we are not serving the function that we have been sent to do, and we are here to serve the people, and we're not doing it, and we're going to make room for other people. And I think the minute that room is made, I said it, I'll say it again, there has been so much unbelievable heroism in Israeli society of everyone, of so many people, and Jewish society has been facing so much. But I'll say about Israeli society, the people who have sacrificed everything and have been serving for months and months and gave their lives and there are so many heroes here who want to serve the people and who are coming from this sense, and for tragically, really, really tragically, right now we are, I want to use the word held captive because it's for another context, but I before that happened, I would say held captive by these leaders.
All right. Well, Rav Avidan Freedman, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to learn with you. And thank you all for joining us. Our next class will be on July 11th. How do we remain optimistic in these troubling times, with Dr. Russ Linden, kind of a nice follow-up to today at 1 p.m. Pacific. So we hope you can all tune into that as well.
I just want to say thank you for a minute. And again, I want to apologize that this is very, apologize that this is very Israel focused, but really leave it as a teacher, leave it as a homework for all of you to think about. What does that mean for me and for where I am and what needs to be done? So thank you.
Thank you very much.